We call it the energy crisis that we're in the midst of. That keeps us all very busy. But like you said, the climate crisis is for the longer term, of course, going to be much more impactful. Therefore, we should not lose momentum. From what I have seen is actually that because of high gas and high fuel prices, the momentum around sustainable solutions has grown enormously. And we should not waste the opportunity now to really accelerate that transition of the energy system.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, founder and chief executive of Aurora. And my guest on the show today is the CEO of Eneco, an electric utility in the Netherlands, with substantial business in retail, district heating, renewables, and thermal generation. In this role, my guest has committed Eneco to full climate neutrality by 2035 for all three scopes of emissions, i.e. even for fossil fuels used by clients. He was formerly at Shell, where he had an international career with a strong focus on the downstream, so retail, petrol, lubricants, those types of things. My guest on the show is As Tempelman. Welcome, As.
Thank you, John. Good morning.
Thanks for joining us. And unusually in the show today, and given the subject matter, I'm also joined by one of Aurora's resident Dutch power market experts to provide some context. Jesse Hettema leads our research for Dutch and Belgian power markets. And before Aurora, he was at Eneco with a focus on strategy and investment. Welcome, Jesse.
Happy to be on the podcast, John.
Great. So as I'd like to start with a question about Shell. You spent 25 years there, a huge organization that has shaped the global energy landscape over a long period of time. One thing that strikes me about Shell is the longevity of careers there and leaders. Yourself as an example, I know Ben van Beurden has been there, must be at least 30 years as well. What is it about Shell that enables it to retain its leaders for so long?
I think that maybe not many people realize the opportunity, the career opportunity space at Shell is just huge. If you consider the Shell's scope of activity is enormous. It stretches oil, gas, chemicals, renewable energy value chains as well, and then in many countries across the globe. And I was fortunate to have an opportunity to work 16 years abroad. In an environment, where there were lots of well-educated, quality people that you can learn from. So I really never had a reason to leave the company because I was continuously challenged with new assignments.
Do you think within Shell, demand for roles within the new energies space, what Shell would have called new energies at least a couple of years ago, outstrips supply of those roles at the moment? Is there a strong gravitation towards those parts of the business at the moment at Shell?
Now, of course, I've not been in Shell the last 2 years, and my understanding is that part of the business is rapidly growing, but it's also still the smaller part of the portfolio, obviously. So maybe in terms of job growth, the numbers are higher on the renewable side, but in terms of sheer size, of course, the fossil business is still much bigger.
We may get a chance to pick up on this topic if we speak about sort of the ESG investing landscape and how organizations like Shell are responding to that with investment, with share buybacks and those types of things. Just one other thought on my mind is, I think what's often lost, particularly for power people, is how integrated the energy system globally is. Like, it is a very physical system, and you actually getting oil into people's petrol tanks is a complex logistical operation, and at least to my mind explains why big oil and gas are some of the biggest, most sophisticated organizations on the planet. But what if you were to sort of put your finger on the most transferable skills from your roles, which were predominantly hydrocarbon focused at Shell, into your existing role? What do you think the most transferable skills have been?
Well, John, I think there are many. I mean, if indeed you were talking about the integration, Shell, of course, operates in value chains of oil products, natural gas, and chemicals. Now, natural gas value chain is also one that we as Eneco are involved in. But of course, the heat value chain and the power value chain are new. But all these value chains have assets, customers, and trade. And therefore, many of the experience from the past is very applicable in my new role as well, whether it's about building large projects like wind parks offshore, or whether it's sales or marketing activities of energy products, or whether it's trading commodities, and it's all very relevant.
Now, I'd like to talk a bit about Eneco and what you're doing there. Before I jump in, I think this is probably a good point just to bring Jesse in from Aurora. So obviously dominant position in the Dutch market. So Jesse, could you just say a few things about where you see the current trends in the Dutch market? What's happening? Where are we in the energy transition? What are the key focus areas?
Yeah, of course, John. I think one of the big trends in the Netherlands is the massive build out of renewables. So a few years ago, the Netherlands was very much a laggard within the European market. So even as close as 2019, we only had a share about 15% of solar and wind in the total electricity demand, and we're moving to more than 70% by 2030. So from a laggard, we're very much moving towards the position of a leader on solar and wind, mostly driven by a massive offshore wind expansion and very high ambitions there. Now, what's very interesting there is that actually also a key element, policy element, is that there's also a simultaneous phase out of subsidies for these renewables. So offshore wind is already without subsidies, and onshore and solar are plans to phase out their subsidies by 2025. Secondly, and this actually ties very much into that phase out of subsidies for renewables, is a big push for decarbonization of demand, with subsidies for electrification of industry, for example, but also high clean hydrogen ambitions. So what you see there is that partially these subsidies are given out through the technology neutral subsidy auction, the SD++, in which all sorts of different technologies compete, but it also includes a lot of things on the demand side. And then also a big climate and transition fund that provides up to 15 billion euros in subsidies for green hydrogen production. So overall, it seems that even though the Netherlands is phasing out subsidies for renewables, it's basically stimulating them indirectly through a massive push for extra demand growth.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for that summary, Jesse. So with that context, I'd like to start with your position on decarbonisation, and it's striking, right? So net zero emissions across phase 1, 2, and 3 by 2035, as I understand it. And for those listening, this is, I think, well out in front, or at least at the time was well out in front of the broader industry within Europe. What do you see it as the hardest part of fulfilling this commitment as?
Well, when we first presented our plan to become carbon neutral by 2035, we also said there are a couple of critical success factors. So one was clearly that the government needs to put in place effective policy, and Jesse was just referring to it. Then secondly, we said that the technology needs to advance in a way that these solutions are actually effective. And also there we feel very confident. And then the third critical success factor was really about the readiness of the market to act. And I would say to your question, John, that the customer readiness remains the hardest part. changing behavior of consumers and convincing businesses to make the right choices is hard. And another challenge I would like to mention is that of the supply chain. One thing is to have a bold plan in place. A whole different matter is to actually execute it successfully at the scale that we would like to see happening. And yes, you just made a reference to it. The enormous growth we foresee on wind offshore, where the country needs to grow from 4 gigawatts to 20 gigawatts. Now, one thing is to plan for that. To actually execute that is going to be really challenging.
It begs a couple of questions. So on the supply chain point, I mean, I don't think I remember a point in time where supply chains globally were more constrained than they are now. And it's interesting you talk about offshore wind. I mean, the big ones in the US are batteries and solar panels. There are people ready to energize their solar parks, and the panels are in Shenzhen, or at least they think they're in Shenzhen, and we'll have to wait and see. Do you see it? I mean, do you see this sort of supply chain bottlenecks as a short-term phenomenon or a medium-term phenomenon that can be resolved, with the market as we see it now, and governments clearly setting an ambition and a signal, or is this a longer-term phenomenon that's going to take, more government involvement in how we sort that out?
Well, I would say both. I mean, if you look at the very short term, the demand of heat pumps and also PV has gone up exponentially as a result also of the very high gas prices in Europe and globally, actually. And we see now that the average delivery time of a heat pump exceeds 9 months. Yeah. But if I look a bit more medium term, with all these wind parks that we want to build, is there enough capacity to build turbines? Will there be enough cables? And will there be enough labor to install all this? Those are really medium, long-term challenges that need, a real structural answer, particularly on the labor side, I would say.
The other point, based on your response, was you laid it out as, to some extent, a contingent commitment if the policy is forthcoming, if the supply chain is forthcoming, and those sorts of things. Is that to say that you think, in general, it won't be specifically all the time, but government needs to lead the energy transition rather than corporations and investors? Should government move ahead of corporations and lead the way? Is that what we should expect from our leaders in Europe?
No, I think it needs to be a public-private interplay, and we should not wait for one another. I would encourage, corporates to not sit still and to actually start acting. I think that all starts, with setting a credible target, and not so much the dates by which corporates want to get to zero, but to actually understand, their current emissions levels, and also understand the emissions that are allowable over the remainder of the lifetime of their companies. Yeah, and that's really getting to grips with the challenge. And once that's done, then of course you got to define smart and executable interventions to bring these emissions down rapidly.
And just philosophically, I mean, how do you think about decarbonisation and profitability? I mean, do you see a conflict between these two objectives in your industry?
Well, I understand very well that in the short term, it might feel like that. Do I really need to invest in sustainable solutions, and can I afford it, particularly coming out of COVID crisis? But then if you think medium, longer term, you find that the world is really changing. And in my view, that first movers can reap huge benefits. I mean, never before have polluters been so unpopular. Never before has capital finding its way to sustainable investment like it does today. And talent clearly is also seeking employment with corporates that have a worthwhile purpose. So I think there's a lot going to think a bit beyond the immediate challenge and position the company and for the future.
Really interesting, and it echoes. So on a previous podcast, we had Alberto De Paoli from Enel on, and I think on your second point of first movers have a huge advantage, and just look at some of the contracts people secured for offshore wind in the early days compared to the competition you're seeing now for them, as one example. But it was his view was and on your first point, it de-risks the business, right? It's sort of, even if there's a cash hit, the discount rate benefit is substantially larger from being in a position where you're consistent with the direction of travel for society. Because if you're not, there are some pretty big risks embedded.
Yeah, it requires a level of courage as well. And, I have great respect for my predecessor who in 2007, made that bold step towards sustainability and, went after the first wind park offshore for Eneco. And I remember he was telling me that the headline then in the Financial Times was Eneco focuses on a small niche, with little potential, and turned out very differently. So I think you got to have some visionary leadership to actually make these bold moves.
I mean, a similar company, I suppose, in some ways to Eneco is Centrica in the UK, British Gas. They had the lease on swathes of seabed, which they gave up, and moved out of some of the onshore wind and things like that. And so there's the punishment for inaction, and their share price is obviously tumbled massively over a period of time. Probably was 1/10 of what it was a few years earlier at one point. So the lessons, there are carrots and sticks here, it feels like, and there's plenty of cautionary tales for people who didn't make those bold moves early on. Okay, I'd like to zoom out from the Eneco situation a little bit. I suppose the question of the moment right now as we speak in mid-April is around the war in Ukraine, and people are trying to make sense of what this means for decarbonisation in the long run. We know some of the facts. We know prices are very high at the moment for energy, for fossil fuels. Coal's up a lot, gas is up astronomically, oil's not too bad. It's a global market. We're starting to see policies from governments. There was aspiration, and now I think in Germany and in the UK we've seen sort of strategy documents around less reliance on Russian gas and a deeper decarbonisation. It's an impossible question, but how do you see the war at the moment impacting the trajectory of decarbonisation in Europe, and I suppose globally?
Well, we call it the energy crisis that we're in the midst of. That keeps us all very busy, but like you said, the climate crisis is for the longer term, of course, going to be much more impactful, and therefore we should not lose momentum. Now, from what I have seen is actually that because of high gas and high fuel prices, the momentum around climate change or the momentum around sustainable solutions has grown enormously. And we should not waste the opportunity now to really accelerate that transition of the energy system. Yeah, and therefore, the long-term fundamentals for the market, I think, remain unchanged. And if anything, we will see an acceleration. So the decarbonisation trend will continue. We expect that will support green power prices. CO2 prices have risen, and we expect they will continue to rise. We will see more urgency around the phase out of natural gas supplied from Russia, but not just Russia, across all supply sources. And also the real appetite, to invest in alternative sources like green biogas and hydrogen.
Do you see the US, just with your sort of midstream, oil and gas hat on? I was in Houston a couple of weeks ago talking to people about the US ability to supply LNG to Europe. Just I suppose one point on that. Do you think US supply of gas to Europe over the next, over a period over which you can build an LNG liquefaction terminal, so 2027 to 2030, something like that, do you see the US coming to the rescue in Europe and being a much larger provider than it currently is?
Well, the LNG are global markets. Of course, the big takers were always in Asia, but I expect more LNG demand in Europe, especially if we start to become less dependent of Russian pipe gas. So many of the global LNG cargoes will find their way to Europe. Now, will they be sourced from the US? I would imagine that the US has a good position to be competitive in their supplies to Europe. So taking all of that into account, I think the short answer would be yes. But it's not just the US. I also expect a lot more cargoes to be sourced from the Middle East.
Yeah, I was sort of doing pop quizzes around Houston a couple of weeks ago and asking people, would you sign the sort of classic Henry Hub indexed take or pay, whatever, 85, 90% contract at $10 per MMBTU, at $12 per MMBTU type of level, and the hands were going up everywhere. So I think the US is a market that produces something like 1,300 BCM of gas per annum. If Russia's 150 BCM, then if hands are going up saying yes, I'll supply it at $10 to $12 on a long-term contract, my gut feeling is there may be a lot more liquefaction in the world along the Gulf Coast and elsewhere over the next 5 or 6 years. And Biden, of course, has signified that he wants to speed up some of that permitting, which is one of the constraints. Anyway, we'll have to wait and see. So I want to talk a bit about big oil. We talked about Shell and its role in your life. The ESG context for me is, some of these big oil and gas companies are really leading the way on decarbonisation. Yes, they've got legacy assets which are carbon intensive. No, it would be we do not want to turn them off now because we're seeing what that looks like in the debates around Europe around reducing dependence on Russian gas, and getting rid of fossil fuels tomorrow is I think demonstrably a bad thing. They're doing it that quickly. And I suppose the Shell response, the BP response, has been part invest in new energies and to a larger extent actually just divesting assets and buying back shares would be my take on recent history here. What role do you see for big oil and gas in the energy transition? How do you see them playing a constructive role?
Like you say, John, I think the world will need still a lot of oil and gas in the foreseeable future. And the developed world, maybe till mid-30s, but the developing world will need it for longer. Yeah. So I guess the question for big oil is, that how do you demonstrate that on the one hand you can efficiently deliver your current business, while successfully investing in the new energy systems, and that has to do with their ability to reinvent themselves. You also have to realize that the fossil business and the renewable energy businesses have very different risk profiles and different returns. So, you will also need shareholder support if you want to diversify into this new world. And therefore, I think that is what these companies, will be struggling with, but not necessarily unsuccessful. We need huge investments in wind offshore, electrolyzers, and other parts of the energy value chain. And big oil brings a lot of money, but also a lot of relevant experience. We talked about it earlier. So I guess the biggest challenge for big oil, John, is really to change the culture from within. And that is not necessarily easy to do.
Could you say a bit about changing the shareholder culture as well? I mean, and what strikes me is, okay, the BP is probably the most striking example. Bernard Looney comes in, he rejigs the whole top team, changes the business around, recruits Anja Dotsmaat from RWE to lead that part of the business. And the share price is tanking, right? Like, he's under a lot of pressure during this period. The Russian war comes. Oil price up above $100. Suddenly the investor pressure is off, is my sense, but it's not off because he persuaded people that we've de-risked the business and we're going green. It's off because oil prices are through the roof, and this is I think a cash machine was the quote. So you talk about changing the culture within. How hard do you think changing the shareholder culture is? Because I mean, to me, as a non-experienced investor, right? I mean, if you don't like the direction of travel, there's plenty of kind of merchant risk investments in fossil fuels you can make. You don't have to invest in BP, and yet it seems like it's this very painful transition from a high risk merchant model to a lower risk utility model. How hard is that transition, do you think, Az?
Yeah, well, I think for all companies, including Eneco, it's really important to get your shareholders on board with your strategy and vision. That, of course, is, what is our current portfolio and what is the portfolio and the company we're trying to build, and what risk profiles are associated with that future portfolio and what returns do we target. And I think for big oil, that's no different. It's just that they need to transition from a fossil world into a renewable energy systems. And that comes with different risk profiles and different returns. So as long as you got your shareholders aligned, I think you could make that transition happen. But not all shareholders think the same. And therefore, the juggle, between views of one on the shareholders who are seeking, higher returns of more of the old world, while others, accept the risk and the returns of the new world, that will be, creating diverging views and therefore a challenge for the executive leadership to manage that. What that results into, I don't want to comment on any company, but I can see the challenge that the teams are dealing with.
Yeah, the virtues of a simplistic ownership structure. I suspect you see that, and maybe the argument is privatization, right? Maybe this transition needs to happen in private rather than in public markets. Anyway, at the same time,
it's also, even though we are we have less complicated shareholder and governance structure, it's still important to really have good debates and good dialogue with your shareholders around what does that future look like. For example, we have recently announced that we want to make material investments into the hydrogen value chain. And you really got to think about, what is the outlook for that hydrogen business? Where in that value chain do I want to participate? And unless you have that clarity with the shareholders, you'll come up with proposals, investment proposals that will be hard to get approval for. So we really spent, and I myself spend a lot of time on getting the shareholder aligned on that.
Could I just digress on that, and then I want to ask you a bit about government policy. But how did you get conviction about going harder into the hydrogen space? And green hydrogen is expensive. Blue hydrogen, there's not a lot of CCUS that's operational around. How do you, before you even go to your stakeholders and say, hey, this is the next offshore wind, or this is the future and we need to be there, how did you get your own conviction that this is the right thing to do?
Well, maybe to put it in a nutshell is that if the world wants to move away from fossil fuels, first of all, you got to electrify whatever you can electrify, and you got to make sure you produce those electrons in a sustainable way. So this is very much around PV and wind. Yeah? But even then, you can up the electricity part of the energy mix, maybe from the current 20 to up to 50%. You're still left with 50% of energy use, which is not easy to electrify because it needs very high temperatures or otherwise. And that part then needs another solution. Where we believe sustainable gases, so green gas, biogas, and hydrogen will be the dominant solution. And then you say, okay, if that were true from an energy mix perspective, is that also the way the government views it, and is that in line with the policies that are being put in place? And what the European Commission has done, but also the German and the Dutch government, is very much so. Yes, I mentioned it earlier, the enormous amounts of money that are made available to develop that hydrogen economy. So for us, it's we don't see it as a threat to our gas business. We see it much more as an opportunity for the future that we embrace, and we will invest in it.
Yeah, interesting. And interesting that you mentioned the sort of conviction around net zero being there. Not in Europe, but in the US, to an extent in Australia, you'll tell people, look, this is where green hydrogen is from a cost perspective, $6 a kilogram, $7 a kilogram. And people go, oh my God, that's so expensive. How's that going to work? And then you have to say, well, in a net zero system, what else are we doing? And to which there's often silence. But there's a premise in here, in a belief in very deep decarbonisation. Arguably, that's one of the benefits of net zero commitments rather than 80% decarbonisation commitments. We had Dan Monzani, who was with the British government at the time, said when you had 80% commitments, everyone thought they were part of the 20%. But when you've got 100% commitment, everyone has to kind of sharpen their pencil and think about what they're going to do. Okay, so plenty of government support for hydrogen. If you're sort of dreaming about the future of policy in Europe, and I suppose in the Netherlands as well, if you could change one thing right now to enable deeper decarbonisation more quickly, what would be the thing you would change in Europe?
I mean, first of all, I think we need to recognize that the European government and also the national governments are really are demonstrating real ambition and putting policy in place to meet those ambitions. So we're very pleased with that. It's always about the carrot and the stick. So carrot in terms of subsidies are made available, and also the stick in terms of putting a price on carbon is really evident. But it's one thing to have that great ambition. I think what is equally important is now to focus on execution. Yeah, and we touched upon that earlier. The governments now need to step up, be clear around how they actually want to go about appointing, the locations for the new wind parks offshore, how they see the tender procedures then being issued and completed, and how they accommodate subsidies where needed, right, to get the hydrogen economy going. So for me, it's now beyond setting a target and allocating budget. What the government now needs to do is focus on execution and to enable, the momentum to really materialize into these projects being realized.
I totally agree. And it feels like it will be a test of the capability of government. These are some very complicated areas. The UK is starting to talk about nodal pricing for power markets. Spain still don't yet have a remunerated primary reserve market for batteries, which means they're not going to deploy. So there are some very thorny, detailed public policy issues that are going to require very talented public sector employees, and I think it will. I think the ones that fare best over the next decade in Europe will be the ones with the most capable governments, because there's some complicated things to be done. I think that you could never hope a politician would get around the detail of. Is my sense. So fingers crossed on some of that.
And therefore, John, you made a reference to Australia, but I see the same in Europe. Is that this public-private interplay and a willingness of governments to consult the private sector in early stages of the implementation is really important. And that can be enabled by having the right level of dialogue and trust between public and private. I think it's an area where we can still do a lot better. And I would really like to invite governments, to start that dialogue and engage us as early as possible.
I totally agree. I'm struck. I think the Nordics is the best place for this. We'll turn up. Aurora hosts sessions for our subscriber groups. Government joins, and in the Nordics, it's just a very open conversation. Hey guys, as an industry, we have a problem. How are we going to fix it? And then there are some other regions which I won't name, where there's no trust, and there's no anything I share will. Is a weakness or is something I'm going to get whacked for later. I can only assume that's an impediment, a handicap to progress. Great. Yes, so I asked Az about the biggest challenges from a policy perspective in the Dutch system, which you're a deep expert in. What do you see as the biggest challenges to decarbonisation over the coming decades?
Yeah, so I think one of the big challenges right now that we don't see a lot of policy on yet is the question on how to produce power at moments of low wind and solar production. This is actually a topic on which we did a big study for the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate. We published this last January. What we found there is that up until something like 2030, there's enough flexibility in the power system to provide power at these moments and to have security of supply. This, amongst others, also comes from new sources like smart charging electric vehicles and things like that. But post 2030, we see a gap. So we see an increasing problem of security of supply, where the current power system is not able to provide enough flexibility. Our study there looked at 20 different technologies that could provide this flexibility in a CO2 neutral way. And there we found that hydrogen power plants, batteries, and biomass combined with carbon capture and storage are best positioned for that. But there's still a big uncertainty on how these assets will actually enter the market. So you could move two ways there. We could stick to the energy-only market as we have it in place right now. But this would probably lead to pretty high peaks in prices at certain moments of tightness, And in some difficult weather situations, so in some years, we can get to a situation of extreme tightness, in which really a lot of industry needs to scale down and things like that. The alternative would be to incentivize a capacity payment in some form of capacity market structure, as we see in other countries. That could help there to provide more of this flexibility to the market and incentivize these hydrogen power plants to be built out. But overall, I think this is really one of the key questions. We're moving, as I said, to a situation with a lot of renewables, but this question of this last 20%, 10% of power is a really big one in the Dutch market right now.
Okay, excellent. So as we finish the show with a segment that I call Overrated Underrated, and the idea is I'm going to present you with some concepts in the energy transition. I'm going to ask you if you think the profession, so someone in our industry, the average person in our industry, view is overrated or underrated. It's easy to say something is good or bad, but it's harder to say whether you think they're overrated or underrated, and that's often where the value is. So let me start with one that is obviously close to your heart: long-term climate commitments by corporates. And by long-term, I typically mean like a 2050 or a 2040. I know you're talking 2035, which is, in the case of many CEOs, 10 years would be beyond the point at which they're in the job. Maybe not in your case. We'll see. But do you think that's an overrated or an underrated concept?
I would say overrated, John.
I like the intellectual integrity of what seems to be a sort of conditional commitment to net zero, which is, look, let's all be honest. Like, if the world is not moving in that direction, it's probably going to be very hard to decarbonize like that. But we will be there if everything else moves in that direction. So interesting.
Yeah. Well, equally, I think that short-term climate commitments are underrated. So one thing is to set a long-term goal. You don't even know where your starting point is, and you don't know how to get there. So the substance is really missing. And then the goal is just a goal. It's often called the blah, 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 right? We have all sorts of good intentions. I think where it gets real is if you really understand what is my allowable emission over the lifetime of my company, and how am I going to allocate that carbon to different business activities, and therefore how do I need to change my operating model, and what interventions am I actually going to execute in the near term to get there. And then it becomes real. Just a long-term commitment is not enough.
Great, wonderful. Okay, the next concept is the importance of heat networks in decarbonising Northern Europe. Do you think they're overrated or underrated?
I would say underrated. The heat networks are an important part of what we call our One Planet plan to be carbon neutral in 2035. It's not the answer for every building, but there is a large part of the existing built environment as well as the new built environments that can operate without any natural gas in the most cost-effective way by putting in place a heat network. Mm-hmm. And we've seen that working very well in the Nordics. You mentioned the Nordics earlier, but there's no reason why that could not be the same for countries like Holland. And actually, we do already have heat networks that have their challenges in terms of perceptions of society. But actually, if you dig into the detail, it's a very cost-effective and attractive solution.
Okay, interesting. So don't close the heat networks, and probably we're going to need to build some new ones as well, it sounds like. The role of blue hydrogen in the EU energy mix. Do you think it's blue hydrogen, obviously hydrogen made from fossil fuels, but with carbon capture technology to reduce the carbon footprint? Do you think the role of blue hydrogen in the EU energy mix is overrated or underrated?
Overrated, I would say. As I shared earlier, we are going to make material investments in the production of green hydrogen. And of course, before we did that, we had a good look at blue hydrogen as well. Mm-hmm. Blue hydrogen has its challenges, for sure. It doesn't have a full capture of the carbon. It's still very dependent on the long-term availability of fossil fuels. But also in terms of the cost curve, we believe that early 30s, green hydrogen will be more cost-effective than blue hydrogen.
Final concept, consumer decisions, as opposed to I suppose, economic ones. So people saying, I like the greenness of this product, or I like the use, I like the convenience of having a charger at my home for my EV. So consumer decisions as opposed to economic ones in driving decarbonisation. Overrated or underrated?
I would say underrated, because like I said earlier, one of the critical success factors is really to change demands. And that is so consumer behavior, but also businesses taking the right decisions is really critical to the success of the energy transition. And we need lasting behavioral change, and we should not underestimate the importance of that.
You would clearly know, as someone who has a large number of customers, and you see how they operate on a daily basis. I think that's a good note to finish on. So thanks to both of my guests. First, Jesse, thanks so much for sharing your expertise of the Dutch market, providing some really useful context for the discussion.
Thank you, John, for the invite.
And finally, Az, thanks so much for taking the time to share your expertise, I suppose, from a wide-ranging career and then from a wide-ranging company at the forefront of the energy transition. So thanks so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you, John.
That was John Feddersen, Aurora's founder and chief executive, speaking to As Tempelman, CEO of Eneco, and Jesse Hettema, the research lead for Dutch and Belgian power markets at Aurora. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.